The Sunday morning, Cora Vass walked into the First Methodist Church of Harlow Creek and found her usual pew occupied by a stranger. She did not stop walking. She slowed. The way you slow when you have nearly stepped on something in the dark and your body knows before your mind does. And then she continued to the end of the row and sat down beside the man as though she had always intended to. The church was full enough that morning. It was the first Sunday of October, which in Harlow Creek meant the harvest was close enough to smell, and people came to church partly for gratitude and partly for the social work of being seen before the long pull of the season kept them home. The pews were crowded toward the middle and the back, the way they always were, because the front rows belonged to the Aldrich family by long custom, and the second and third rows had been, for 11 years, left to Cora Vass by a courtesy that had curdled into something else entirely. She was 34 years old. She had come to Harlow Creek 11 years prior as the wife of Douglas Vass, who had died of a fever 2 winters in and left her the small house on the eastern edge of town, a quarter section of rocky pasture she could not work alone, and a last name that sat in this town like a stone in a boot. Douglas had borrowed money from men who did not forgive borrowing. He had made promises about the land that he had no right to make, and had left Cora to answer for all of it, which she did, quietly and in full, over the course of 7 years, until every debt was cleared. The town had watched her do it and had not, as a result, warmed to her. There is a kind of person whose survival is taken as an inconvenience by the people who predicted their failure. Cora Vass was that kind of person, and Harlow Creek was that kind of town. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her chin level in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart, and she did not look at the man beside her. He looked at her, briefly, the way you look at someone you have nearly bumped into, with a quick assessment and then a return to minding your own business. He was large in the way of a man who works with his body, broad through the shoulder, with hands that rested on his knees like tools set down. He was wearing a clean shirt that had been ironed by someone who was not practiced at ironing. His hat was on his knee. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been outside for a long time. He did not move to make room. He did not move away. He simply sat, and when the service began, he opened his hymnal to the correct page without being told, which meant he had been to church before, somewhere. What happened next was the thing the town would talk about for the better part of 2 weeks. Mabel Greer, who sat 3 rows back and had a voice built for distance, leaned forward and said, in a tone she had prepared at home, that the stranger might not know that this particular pew had been empty for a reason. The church went the way churches go when something is said that should not have been said inside one. Perfectly quiet. The man turned. He looked at Mabel Greer with a steadiness that was not hostile and not apologetic, the way you look at weather you have already decided to walk through. Then he looked at Cora. Cora's face was doing what she needed it to do. Her eyes were forward. Her hands were still. He turned back to the front and did not move. By the second autumn, people in Harlow Creek would stop calling the vast land cursed. Cora did not know that yet. She was sitting in her pew beside a man she did not know, listening to the organ start up, and she was not going to give Mabel Greer the satisfaction of a single visible breath more than necessary. His name, she would learn after the service when he introduced himself on the church steps with the directness of a man who does not see the point of waiting, was Eli Cutter. He had come from the Dakotas. He had bought the Harmon place, the 300 acres on the North Ridge that had gone fallow for 4 years since old Pete Harmon's sons had quarreled over it, and neither had wanted it enough to stay. He had a daughter of 7 and a son of 12, and a wagon full of things he had not yet unpacked. He said all of this the way you state facts that are simply true and require no apology. She said her name. She said she lived on the East Quarter. He said he had seen the fencing on his way in. Good straight lines, he said. Not everyone bothers. She said she bothered. He nodded once, put his hat on, and went to collect his children from the yard where they had been waiting with the patience of children who have learned that waiting is simply what you do. Cora walked home alone, as she always did, and did not think about him more than was reasonable, which was to say she thought about him precisely once more, when she was hanging her good dress and noticed that her hands were entirely steady, and was briefly, privately glad of it. The offer came 4 days later. She was at the feed store on Wednesday when Eli Cutter came through the door and stopped at the counter with a list written in a plain hand on the back of an envelope. He ordered what he needed, which was considerable, and while Gus Pryor was pulling the order, he turned and found Cora at the seed bins and said, without preamble, that he had heard she knew the North Ridge land. She said she knew it some. She had helped Pete Harmon with his kitchen garden 2 summers running, in exchange for use of his root cellar. He said the kitchen garden was gone to weeds, and he had 2 children who needed feeding through winter, and he was better with cattle and timber than with growing things. She said that was honest of him to admit. He said he was looking for someone who could put the kitchen garden back in order and help with the household until he got the place running properly. He could pay a fair wage, and there was a room off the kitchen that was separate from the main house, with its own door, if she wanted to know that. She did want to know that. She said so. He said it would be temporary, however long it took to get settled, and that he understood if she had other work. She had other work. She took in mending, and she helped at the schoolhouse 2 afternoons a week, and she sold preserves, and she had been doing all of these things for 11 years, and none of them together added up to enough to fix the east fence before winter, which she had been thinking about since August. She said she would come and look at the garden and give him an honest assessment. He said that was all he was asking. They settled on a wage that was fair and a start date of the following Monday, and shook hands the way people do when they have agreed to something plain and practical that does not require elaboration. His hand was dry and very steady. She let go of it without difficulty and went back to the seed bins. Gus Pryor watched all of this from behind the counter, with the particular attention of a man who knows he has just been handed something worth repeating, and Cora knew it and decided it did not matter because the east fence needed fixing, and she was not going to let it fall down for the sake of what Gus Pryor chose to say about her at supper. The Harmon place, which was now the Cutter place, was in worse shape than she had expected, and better shape than she had feared. The house was sound. Pete Harmon had built well, low and tight against the ridge, with thick walls and a good roof, and a porch that wrapped the south side and caught the afternoon light. What it lacked was order. 4 years of emptiness had let things go soft and cluttered, and Eli Cutter's arrival had added to the disorder rather than resolved it. Because a man alone with 2 children and a cattle operation to establish does not have time to think about where the kitchen things belong. Cora thought about it. By the end of the first week, the kitchen was organized on a logic that made sense. The larder had been inventoried and restocked against the coming cold, and the kitchen garden had been cleared of its weeds and assessed. She told Eli that the soil was still good, and that if they moved quickly, there was time for a late planting of root vegetables and winter greens that would carry them through to spring. He said to do what she thought was right. She did. The children were Nora, who was 7 and had her father's steadiness and her mother's eyes, which were a gray-green that Cora had no information about, and Thomas, who was 12 and had decided before she arrived that he did not need anyone managing his household, and communicated this decision through a consistent and focused silence. She did not try to manage Thomas. She cooked and cleaned and worked the garden, and spoke to him when spoken to, and did not make any claims on his loyalty or his warmth. She left him alone with the same respect she would have given a grown man, which was, she suspected, what he needed most. On the 3rd day, she found him in the barn with a saddle he was trying to repair with the wrong tool, and she said, without stopping, that the fro on the 2nd shelf would work better for that particular stitch. She kept walking. She heard, 10 minutes later, the sound of the work going more smoothly. He said nothing about it. She said nothing about it. This was the beginning of something, though neither of them would have called it that. Nora was easier and in some ways harder. She attached the way young children do, without strategy or self-protection, following Cora through the kitchen and the garden with a running commentary on everything she observed, which was considerable. She had a serious face and a habit of asking questions that required real answers, not the softened versions adults usually offered children. She asked Cora on the 4th day why she didn't have any children of her own. Cora said that sometimes that was just how things went. Nora considered this with the gravity it deserved, and said that she thought Cora would be good at it. Cora said that was kind of her to say, and handed her a bunch of late carrots to carry to the kitchen, and they went on with the afternoon. Eli himself was not much in the house during those first weeks. He was up before light, and out to the cattle and the fencing and the drainage work that the North Ridge required. And he came in at dark and ate what was on the table and said what needed saying about the next day's work and went to bed. He was not unfriendly. He was simply a man with too much to do who had organized himself around the doing of it, and conversation was not on the list unless it was useful. She respected this because she was built the same way. What she noticed, and did not comment on, was that he ate everything she put in front of him with the focused attention of a man who has been eating his own cooking for a long time and has not forgotten what it is to eat something made with care. He did not compliment the food. He cleaned his plate and was quiet about it, which she understood to mean the same thing. On the second Friday, she made a beef and potato pie with the last of the garden's early onions and a crust that came out better than she had expected. And Eli Cutter sat down, looked at the table, and then looked at her with an expression that moved across his face briefly and was set aside before it became anything she would have had to respond to. Thomas had 2 helpings. Nora said it was the best thing she had ever eaten in her life, which was the kind of thing 7-year-olds say, and which Cora did not put too much weight on. But she noted that Eli's plate was clean before anyone else's. The room off the kitchen had its own door, as promised, and a window that looked east toward her own land, which she could see on clear mornings as a dark line of fence against the pale sky. She had brought her sewing basket and her 3 books and the small tin box that had been her mother's, which held nothing now but a few letters and a dried flower from a garden she no longer remembered clearly. She set these things on the shelf above the narrow bed, and they made the room hers in the way that a few objects can make a space yours if you have learned not to need more than that. She had learned not to need more than that a long time ago. The town noticed her absence from her usual Wednesday morning errands, and Mabel Greer was heard to say, at the dry goods counter, that she supposed Cora Vass had found a situation at the Cutter place, and the way she said situation carried everything she meant it to carry. Ruth Aldrich, who was standing nearby and had more sense than most, said that the North Ridge land needed working and someone had to do it, and the conversation moved on, but not before it had done its work. Cora heard about it secondhand, the way you always hear things in a small town, low and fast and ahead of yourself. She did not alter her behavior in any direction. She went to the feed store on Wednesday as usual, and to the schoolhouse on Thursday and Friday afternoons, and came back to the Cutter place each evening, and made supper and minded her business. It was a Thursday morning, 3 weeks into October, when the thing happened that she would return to later, in the quiet of the room off the kitchen, and understand as the moment the shape of things began to change. She had been up early to start bread and had gone out to check the garden in the gray light before the sun cleared the ridge, and she had found the loose board on the bottom porch step, the one she had been stepping around for 2 weeks, replaced, not patched, replaced, with a new board cut to fit and set flush and solid, the wood pale against the weathered gray of the rest of the step. She stood and looked at it for a moment, then she went inside and started the bread. Nothing was said about the step. She said nothing about it either. But that evening when she set his coffee on the counter before going to her room, she set it where he would find it without looking, in the place that was already becoming his place. And she was aware, in a way she had not been before, that this was a thing she was choosing to do. He came in from the cold and found it there, and stood for a moment before he picked it up. Nothing was said about that either. The weeks moved the way weeks do in October on working land, fast and full and ending before you are ready. The root vegetables went in and came up and were brought in before the first hard frost, which arrived on a Wednesday night with a wind off the ridge that stripped the last color from the aspens and left the world gray and clean and cold. Cora banked the kitchen fire before bed, and in the morning found that Eli had already been up and added wood, so that the kitchen was warm when she came in, and the coffee was on, which had not been part of any arrangement they had made. She poured herself a cup and started breakfast and did not remark on it. He came in from the barn and sat down, and they ate in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the weeks. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of the small, acknowledged things that don't require words. Thomas had begun, without announcement, to set the table in the evenings. He did this with the same focused silence with which he did everything, placing the plates and the forks with a precision that suggested he had thought about it. Cora did not thank him for it in a way that would have embarrassed him. She simply worked around it as though it had always been the arrangement. It was Nora who said the thing. It was a Sunday, the last one before November, and they had all come back from church together in the wagon, which had become the habit without anyone deciding it should be. And Eli had lifted Nora down from the wagon seat, and she had run ahead to the porch, and then turned back and called out, in the clear carrying voice of a child who does not understand that some words land differently than others, that Mama had left her good scarf in the wagon. The yard went still. Eli had one hand on the wagon wheel. Thomas was halfway to the barn. Cora was standing on the second porch step, the new board solid under her foot, and she felt the word land in her chest the way a stone lands in still water, with a weight that spread outward in all directions. Nora realized almost immediately, in the way children do, that she had said something that mattered, and her face went careful and uncertain. Cora said, her voice entirely even, that the scarf was on the seat under the blanket, and she should bring it in before the cold got to it. Nora went to get the scarf. Eli did not look at Cora. He began unhitching the horse with the steady, deliberate movements of a man who is giving himself something necessary to do with his hands. The back of his neck was dark from the sun, and she could see, from where she stood, that he had gone very still inside the movement, the way water goes still under the surface while the top keeps moving. Thomas went into the barn. Cora went inside and started Sunday dinner, and did not let herself think about it directly, the way you do not look directly at certain kinds of light. She thought instead about the onions and the potatoes and the cold coming down off the ridge, and she kept her hands busy and her face quiet. And by the time Eli came in, she had the kitchen smelling of something warm, and the table set, and Nora at her elbow asking about the bread, and the afternoon continued. But something had changed. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them were going to say so, not yet, and maybe not for a while, and that was all right. Some things change the moment you look at them straight. There was no need to look straight at it yet. November came, and with it the thing she had been half expecting. His name was Warren Holt, and he was the man who had held the paper on the Harmon land for the 4 years it sat fallow. A man who had lent Pete Harmon's sons money against the property when they were quarreling over it, and had expected to end up with the land itself when they couldn't settle. He had not expected Eli Cutter to arrive from the Dakotas with cash money and a clean title, and he had not taken it well. What he had done in the weeks since was talk. He talked at the bank and at the feed store and at the saloon on Friday evenings, and what he talked about was the Cutter place and the woman Eli Cutter had brought in to run it, and the way he talked about it was designed to do the most damage with the least that could be held against him. He said he supposed some men didn't much care what people thought. He said he had heard the woman had been alone a long time, and a man couldn't blame her for making the most of a situation. He said he hoped for the children's sake that things were being conducted properly. He said this kind of thing in the particular tone of a man who is expressing concern. Cora heard about it, as she heard about everything, low and fast. She did not change her behavior. She went to town on her usual days, and did her usual work, and came back to the Cutter place, and cooked supper, and minded the garden, and helped Nora with her letters in the evenings, and said nothing to Eli about any of it. She had been managing her own reputation in this town for 11 years. She knew that responding to Warren Holt directly would give his words more weight than they deserved, and that the only answer to that kind of talk was the plain evidence of a life conducted plainly, which she was already providing. What she had not accounted for was that Eli would hear it too. He heard it on a Friday, from Gus Pryor at the feed store, who told him with the apologetic directness of a man who thinks you should know. And Eli came home that evening with a quietness that was different from his usual quietness, tighter and more contained, and he ate supper without speaking, and after the children were in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked at the grain of the wood for a long time. Cora was at the other end of the table with her mending. She waited, he said, without looking up, that he had heard what Holt was saying. She said she had heard it too. He said he was sorry for it. She said it wasn't his to be sorry for. He looked at her then, the full, direct look of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it, and she met it without flinching, her hands still on the mending, her face doing what she needed it to do. He said that he intended to deal with it. She said she would prefer he didn't do anything that would make more noise than the original. He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. He said he wasn't planning on noise. She went back to her mending. He finished his coffee. The fire settled. The wind came down off the ridge and pressed against the south side of the house, and the house held against it, the way Pete Harmon had built it to do. What Eli Cutter did was not loud, and it was not violent, and it was, in its way, more effective than either. He went to the bank on a Monday morning, and he paid off the note that Warren Holt held against the Harmon land, which was the last remaining piece of paper that gave Holt any claim to standing in the matter. He paid it in full, in cash, and he asked for the note to be marked satisfied in the ledger and a copy made for his records. And he did this in front of 3 men who were in the bank at the time, including Roy Aldrich, who was on the town council and whose wife had more sense than most. Then he went to the dry goods store, where Mabel Greer happened to be. And he bought what he needed, and he said, in the plainest possible terms, in response to nothing Mabel had said because Mabel had not yet said anything, that he ran a proper household and that Cora Vass was a woman of good character who had his complete respect, and that he would consider it a courtesy if the town treated her accordingly. He said this without heat and without apology, the way you state facts that are simply true. Mabel Greer said she was sure no one had suggested otherwise. He said that was good to hear. He bought his dry goods and left. The town watched and stored it up for the way the town always stores things, and the thing it stored this time was different from what it had been storing about Cora Vass for 11 years. What it stored this time was the image of a man paying a debt in full and stating a plain truth in public and walking away without waiting to see how it landed, which is the posture of a man who is not performing anything. Warren Holt was at the saloon that Friday, and he said nothing about the Cutter place or the woman at it, and he said nothing the Friday after that. And after a while, the silence became the thing he was known for on the subject, which was as close to an apology as such a man was capable of giving. Cora learned what Eli had done from Ruth Aldrich, who told her on a Thursday afternoon at the schoolhouse with a directness that was also a kind of gift. And Cora stood in the cold schoolyard and listened and said nothing until Ruth was finished. Then she said that she appreciated Ruth telling her. She walked back to the Cutter place and started supper, and when Eli came in from the ridge, she looked at him across the kitchen, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing to say that the looking didn't already cover. But she set his coffee down that evening with a care that was different from the care she had been taking before, and she thought he knew the difference, and she thought that was all right. It was a Saturday in late November, the kind of day that arrives with a low gray sky and a cold that has decided to stay. When Eli Cutter came in from the barn at midday instead of evening and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, his hat in his hand, looking at her in the way she had come to recognize as him working up to something that required more words than he usually used. Nora was at the schoolhouse for the Saturday reading hour. Thomas was in the barn. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the sound of the wind finding the eaves. He said he had been thinking. She waited. He said that the arrangement they had made in October had been for a temporary situation, and that he understood the original terms and he was not trying to change them without her say. She kept her hands on the bread she was working and said she was listening. He said that the house ran better than it ever had, and that the children were settled, and that the root cellar was full, and the garden was put to bed properly for the first time since Pete Harmon's wife had been alive to do it. He said he knew that was her work, and he knew what it was worth, and he had not been paying her what it was worth, which was something he intended to correct regardless of anything else. She said the wage had been fair. He said the wage had been fair for what he had asked for, and she had done considerably more than that, which was true, and she knew it, and he knew it, and there was no point pretending otherwise. She said all right. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands with a slow steadiness, and then he said that he was asking her to stay, permanent, as his wife, if that was what she would want. He said he was not asking because of the cooking or the garden or the children, though all of those things were real and he would not pretend they weren't. He said he was asking because he had been a man carrying too much alone for long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight, and since October he had noticed it lifting, and he knew why, and he was not the kind of man who could know a thing like that and not say it. He said he understood if she needed time. He said he would wait as long as she needed, and that if her answer was no, he would honor it without argument and make sure she had what she needed to go, and that was a promise he would keep. He said he wanted her to know that the choice was entirely hers to make. Then he stopped talking and waited, his hat still in his hands, his face open in the way it almost never was, the careful surface set aside for long enough to let her see what was underneath it. The kitchen held the warmth of the fire and the smell of the bread and the cold pressing at the window glass. And Cora stood with her hands still and looked at this man who had sat beside her in church when he had not been told he was supposed to, who had replaced the porch step without saying a word about it, who had gone to the bank on a Monday morning and paid a debt that was not his to pay because her name had been spoken carelessly by a man with a grudge. She thought about the room off the kitchen with its east-facing window and her 3 books on the shelf and her mother's tin box. She thought about Nora's voice in the yard, clear and carrying and without strategy. She thought about 11 years of walking home alone from church and the east fence that needed fixing, and the particular quality of the silence in this kitchen, which was not the silence of absence but the silence of 2 people who had run out of the need to fill space with noise. She said yes. She said that was what she wanted. He went very still for a moment, the way he had gone still in the yard the day Nora said the word that landed like a stone in still water. And then he let out a breath that was slow and even, and set his hat on the table and crossed the kitchen and took her hand in both of his. The way you hold something you have been waiting to hold carefully. He said her name once. She said his. That was enough. They were married on a Saturday in December by the same minister who had watched Mabel Greer lean forward in her pew 6 weeks prior and had said nothing at the time, and now stood at the front of the First Methodist Church of Harlow Creek and said the words that needed saying with a gravity that suggested he understood what he was presiding over. Thomas stood beside his father. Nora stood beside Cora with a gravity that was her father's and a joy she could not entirely contain, which was her own. Ruth Aldrich was there, and Roy Aldrich, and Gus Pryor, and a good number of the town, because a wedding in December is a thing people come to, and because word had gotten around, as word does in Harlow Creek, low and fast and ahead of itself. Mabel Greer was there. She sat in the 4th row, and she was quiet throughout, which was the most anyone could have asked of her. Warren Holt was not there. The pew where Cora had sat alone for 11 years was full. By the time the frost settled in for good and the days went short and the ridge was white from the tree line up, the Cutter place had the quality of a house that has found its own weight, solid and warm and not waiting for anything to be different than it was. Cora had moved her 3 books and her sewing basket and her mother's tin box from the room off the kitchen to the room she shared with Eli, and the room off the kitchen had become Thomas's room, which he had accepted with the same focused silence with which he accepted most things, and which Cora understood to mean that he was glad of it. Nora had taken to sitting beside Cora at the kitchen table in the evenings with her letters and her small, serious questions, and Cora answered them as honestly as she could, which Nora seemed to find satisfactory. The east fence had been repaired in November, before the wedding, by Eli and Thomas on a Saturday when the weather held. And when Cora saw it on the first clear morning after the last snow, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at it for a long moment. The lines straight and solid against the white, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. The sewing basket sat on the shelf in the main room now, in the light from the south window, and she used it in the evenings when the day's work was done and the house was quiet. It was not the same as it had been in the room off the kitchen. It was the same basket and the same window light, but it meant something different now. The way a thing can be itself and also be transformed by where it is placed and who is in the room with it. Eli came in one evening in late December and found her there with the mending and Nora asleep against her side, the child's dark head heavy on her arm, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold still on him and looked at the two of them in the lamplight, with an expression that he did not set aside this time, that he let stay on his face for the full length of a breath before he crossed the room and sat down beside her and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. She looked at him. He looked at her. Nothing needed to be said. The fire was going and the lamp was burning, and outside the ridge was white, and the cold was doing what cold does in December in that country, which is to make the inside of a warm house feel like a thing that was built specifically for you, like the world arranged itself around this particular warmth on purpose. The tin box sat on the shelf above the bed in the room they shared. She had not opened it since she moved in, not because she had forgotten it, but because there was nothing in it she needed to look at just now. The letters and the dried flower were still there, her mother's handwriting on the envelopes. The flower from a garden she no longer remembered clearly. They would keep. She had time. On the first Sunday of the new year, they walked into the First Methodist Church of Harlow Creek together, the 4 of them, and they sat in the pew that had been empty for 11 years, and it was full, and Mabel Greer said nothing, and the organ started up, and the morning light came through the east windows the way it always had, falling across the wood of the pews in long pale bars, and Cora Vass, who was Cora Cutter now, sat with her husband's shoulder warm against hers and Nora's small hand in her lap and the winter light on her face, and she was entirely still, not in the way she had been still for 11 years, which was the stillness of a woman braced against something, but in the way of a woman who has nothing left to brace against. The cabin held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not anymore. That was the story of Cora Vass and Eli Cutter, a woman who had sat alone in the same pew for 11 years, and a man who didn't know he wasn't supposed to sit beside her, and everything that followed from that one plain act of not moving. Let me know in the comments if this one found you where you needed it.